The morning in Flaxborough began with the sort of soft, indifferent drizzle that never quite admitted to being rain. It clung instead to hedges, windows, and the collars of those few who ventured out early, settling itself over the town like a damp shawl. Inspector Purbright, whose appreciation for meteorological understatement bordered on admiration, stepped from his front door with the mild expression of a man who expected neither excitement nor disappointment from the day ahead. He did not, for instance, expect to be thinking about ghosts before breakfast. At St. Olaf's church, the caretaker, Mr. Biddle, had already been up for several hours. He preferred the company of old stone and pew polish to the chatter of townsfolk, and so regarded his pre-dawn duties as something of a monastic retreat. It was during this quiet hour, when the nave lay half in shadow and half in the faint suggestion of dawn, that he heard it. A voice, very soft, almost reverent, a man's voice murmuring to someone Biddle could not see. He froze near the vestry door, the key in his hand, trembling only slightly. Biddle was not by nature fearful, but the sound possessed an uncanny quality, thin and wavering, like a breeze passing through a cracked window. By the time he gathered enough courage to step forward, the whispering had stopped. The church was empty, cold, and entirely too still. What remained was a hat, a felt trilby, dark green, placed on a pew as if its owner might return at any moment. Beside it lay a single folded sheet of paper. Biddle, with the solemnity of one handling evidence in a sacred matter, brought both objects to the vicar, who in turn telephoned the police. His call, coloured by clerical anxiety, suggested that a man had possibly collapsed, disappeared, or, though the vicar struggled to articulate it, manifested in some less corporeal fashion. Purbright arrived some 20 minutes later. He found the vicar and caretaker standing side by side near the front pew, both staring at the hat with identical expressions of tentative dread. The inspector greeted them with his usual courteous neutrality, a tone that managed to reassure without promising anything. The hat was unremarkable, though well kept. Its lining bore the initials E.M. Purbright lifted it gently, examined the stitching, and placed it back. The folded paper proved more interesting, a brief, handwritten note in a slanted hand, unsigned. I come to them because they cannot contradict me. If you judge me, do so softly. Purbright read the sentence twice, then a third time, recognizing at once the deliberate ambiguity. It had the tone of confession, without specifying a sin. "Did either of you hear anything unusual?" he asked. Biddle straightened his spine with an air of wounded propriety. "Whispering, sir. A man speaking very quiet-like. Almost praying, but not with words I recognized." Purbright nodded. "And you saw no one leave?" "No, Inspector, I would have heard the door." The vicar clasped his hands, troubled. "We have had, on rare occasions, troubled souls wandering in for comfort. But this felt different." Purbright did not press him for elaboration. Experience had taught him that vicars, when confronted with inexplicable events, often drifted toward theological generalities. Instead, he asked to walk the church. St. Olaf's was a sturdy building of grey stone and polite architecture, the sort that resisted drama. Its stained glass windows glowed faintly even on a dim morning, their saints captured mid-gesture like actors frozen during rehearsal. Purbright moved between the pews with a measured pace, observing the small details that so often betrayed larger truths. Near the front pew, he crouched. A smear of dark earth lay on the floorboard, a thin line leading toward the aisle. Not recent, but recent enough to suggest someone had come in from the rain-damp churchyard. "What time do the gates open?" he asked Biddle. "They're never locked, sir. Folks come and go, pilgrims of habit mostly." Purbright allowed himself a small inward smile. Indeed. The building offered no further clues, no footprints, no discarded belongings, no sign of intrusion. If a man had whispered to ghosts, he had done so with remarkable tidiness. By late morning, the drizzle had thinned to a mist. Purbright, walking back toward the station, found his mind returning not to the whispering itself, but to the line in the letter. "They cannot contradict me." It hinted at a confession offered to those who could not reply. The dead, real or imagined. Flaxborough had produced many oddities over the years, well-intentioned frauds, misdirected passions, and the occasional enthusiastic meddler, but confessions addressed to ghosts suggested a subtler form of unrest. At the station, he placed the hat and letter in a brown evidence envelope, more out of procedure than expectation. He instructed Sergeant Love to inquire discreetly after any man with the initials EM who had recently behaved unusually, withdrawn from public life, or been reported missing. Love, with his characteristic blend of good cheer and mild confusion, promised to do so. By midday, Purbright sat at his desk with a cup of lukewarm tea, watching a stripe of pale light creep across the floorboards. The morning had begun, as most did, with an unassuming quiet. Yet something in St. Olaf's suggested a story half told. A man who whispered to ghosts, a hat abandoned on a pew, a letter addressed to no one and everyone. Purbright sensed that whatever lay behind these fragments would not be solved by urgency, but by patience, the kind of patience that allowed secrets to come forward when they had tired of hiding. For now, he waited. By early afternoon, the drizzle had thinned to a faint silver breath drifting across Market Street, soft enough to let the shopkeepers resume their habitual positions near open doors and polished counters. Flaxborough's commerce depended as much on conversation as on goods, and any hint of mystery circulated with the brisk efficiency of a municipal notice. Word of the whispering man from St. Olaf's had already slipped between bakeries, the post office, and the chemist's before Purbright finished his second cup of tea. The first embroidered version arose at Mrs. Vinton's greengrocer's store, where apples were weighed with the solemnity of courtroom evidence. A customer insisted she had heard the church bells toll once at an unnatural hour, despite no such chime having been recorded. Another swore she had glimpsed a moving shadow near the lich gate, though upon polite questioning she admitted it might have been a cyclist hurrying home. No detail was too small for embellishment, none too uncertain to be told with confidence. Inside the station, Purbright listened as Love relayed the morning's overheard rumours. The sergeant reported them with his usual earnestness, each tale punctuated by a furrow of concentration, as if accuracy might yet be salvaged from the town's enthusiastic embroidery. "One lad from the choir says he saw someone pale as chalk standing by the east wall," Love announced, consulting a notepad already filled with scribbled names and arrows. "Said the figure vanished when he blinked." "Did he mention whether it vanished by walking away?" Purbright asked mildly. Love paused. "No, sir, just vanished." "Well, that is the more efficient method." Love coloured faintly. "Should I take a statement?" "Not yet." Purbright closed the evidence envelope on his desk with a soft rustle. "Let us allow the story to grow a little. It may reveal its roots." He stepped outside a few minutes later, the air sharp with the faint scent of wet stone. A distant gull cried above the rooftops, its call echoing off the church spire in a way that made the street feel briefly hollow. Purbright walked with the unhurried gait of a man who knew that answers often arrived at their own pace, and that pushing them tended only to bruise them. At the corner near Cribben's bakery, a small cluster of townsfolk had gathered. Their collective posture, half facing one another, half facing the church, suggested a shared fascination balanced precariously with superstition. Purbright approached, with his customary air of pleasant detachment. Mrs. Cribben, who prided herself on a well-informed outlook, lifted her chin. "Inspector, I suppose you've heard about the visitor?" "I've heard several versions," Purbright replied. "I'm trying to determine which is the most polite." A couple of the onlookers laughed softly, grateful for the inspector's steadying tone. "He was whispering to someone," Mrs. Cribben insisted. "That's what Biddle said, whispering to thin air, no less. And that hat of his, left as if he meant to return for it." Purbright nodded. "People leave things in churches all the time. Keys, gloves, promises." "It's unsettling," another woman murmured, "like he came to speak with the dead." Purbright glanced toward the churchyard, where gravestones leaned with the familiarity of old friends, their inscriptions softened by lichen and years. A faint breeze moved through the long grass, stirring it in gentle waves. Whatever had transpired that morning had clearly found fertile ground in the imaginations of Flaxborough's residents. He thanked the group and moved on, his coat brushing lightly against the damp iron railings. Down Bishop's Lane, the windows of the library glowed with a warm amber light. Inside, Miss Peebling, the librarian, was shelving a stack of returned books with the resigned diligence of someone who had seen the entire town's reading habits laid bare. She jumped slightly when she noticed Purbright standing a few paces behind her. "Inspector, you startled me." "My apologies. I wondered if anyone had recently borrowed titles on, say, spiritualism." She hesitated, fingers still resting on a spine of the Lives of the Saints. "We do have a few volumes on such matters. Old donations mainly." "And were any returned this morning?" Her eyes flicked toward a tray behind the desk. "One, actually. Voices Beyond the Veil, not a popular choice." "Was it signed out?" "No name, I'm afraid." "Someone must have taken it without registering." Purbright considered this. Anonymous borrowing was not unheard of, but combined with the morning's events, it suggested a pattern forming quietly beneath the surface. A soft thud sounded near the front entrance, the muffled footfall of a child. A chorister, still in partial uniform, stood awkwardly holding a music folder. "Oh, Inspector," the boy said, cheeks reddening. "I didn't know anyone was in here." Purbright offered a small nod. "You were seen near the churchyard this morning, I hear." The boys swallowed. "Well, yes, I was early for practice, and I saw someone by the gravestones." "What sort of someone?" "A man, thin, very pale. He looked like he was talking to the stones." The boy's voice dropped. "Then he slipped behind the old tomb and, well, I didn't see him again." "Slipped how?" Purbright asked gently. "Just moved out of sight. Quick." Purbright thanked him and watched as the boy hurried out, shoes pattering softly on the stone floor. The inspector turned the information over in his mind, aware that young imaginations often embellished what adults feared to acknowledge. Outside, the church bells chimed the hour, steady, reassuring, and very much alive. Purbright paused beneath the spire, studying the muted-coloured clouds drifting across the sky like slow-moving thoughts. Somewhere within the town's chorus of speculation lay a quieter truth, one that resisted the glare of excitement and preferred the shade of modest corners. He would find it, but not by chasing shadows. Purbright resumed his walk toward the station, the faint rustle of the anonymous letter in his pocket pressing lightly against his coat, as though reminding him that the whispering man, whoever he was, had not come to the church seeking drama, but absolution. And absolution, Purbright knew, rarely announced itself. It whispered. The afternoon settled into a subdued stillness, the kind that often followed a burst of town-wide chatter, as if Flaxborough itself were catching its breath. Purbright crossed the churchyard once more, the faint crunch of gravel underfoot softened by damp moss. A few starlings hopped between the stones, their sharp cries echoing lightly beneath the grey October sky. The inspector paused at the lich gate before continuing toward the vestry door, where Mr. Biddle stood polishing a brass latch with a vigour that suggested he wished to remove the mourning from it entirely. "Back again, Inspector?" Biddle asked, the cloth pausing mid-rub. "Only to clarify a detail or two," Purbright replied, his tone as unhurried as the drifting mist. "When you heard the whispering, were you standing exactly here?" Biddle shifted his weight. "Near enough. I'd just opened the vestry door, thought I heard someone answering back, but when I stepped inside there was only the pew creaking." Purbright nodded, stepping into the nave. The air held the faint scent of wood polish and extinguished candles, mingled with the cool breath of stone. His footsteps echoed with a modest reverence appropriate to the place. He stopped beside the pew where the hat had been left, fingers brushing the polished wood, as though feeling for impressions in its grain. "Did anything else seem out of place?" he asked without turning. Biddle hesitated. "Well, the door to the side yard was unlatched. I always check it at night, and I'm certain I locked it, but I suppose someone could have forced it without breaking anything. Or perhaps someone with a key came through," Purbright said, though that too raises its own questions. He thanked the caretaker and crossed to the vicar's office, where a lamp glowed softly against the gloom. The vicar, seated at a desk surrounded by ledgers and hymnals, looked up with a weary smile that tried for reassurance. "I assume you're here to tell me this was all a harmless misunderstanding," he said. "I seldom assume misunderstandings are harmless," Purbright replied gently, "only that they are plentiful." The vicar sighed, removing his spectacles. "I've had parishioners dropping by all afternoon. One woman insists she felt a chill on the back of her neck during morning prayers, as though the visitor were behind her. Another claimed she heard a sigh from the pulpit." He lifted a hand. "We had no sermon." Purbright offered a mild smile in sympathy. Churches are adept at gathering echoes. Some are older than others. "And the note?" the vicar asked, lowering his voice. "For now, it remains between us," Purbright replied. "I don't intend to set the town ablaze with speculation more elaborate than necessary." The vicar leaned back, visibly relieved. "Thank you. People find comfort in mystery, but only when it behaves itself." Purbright left him to his ledgers and stepped into the crisp afternoon light. The mist had thinned, revealing the narrow lane that led back toward the library. A faint breeze stirred fallen leaves along its edges, sending them tumbling in small spirals that whispered against the cobbles. Miss Peebling looked up from her desk the moment he entered, her spectacles perched precariously at the end of her nose. She seemed more distressed than earlier, her fingers hovering nervously over a stack of returned books. "Inspector, I thought you might come back." Purbright approached with the quiet step of a man accustomed to calming nervous witnesses. "I sensed you had more to say." She glanced around the empty reading room before lowering her voice. "Someone has been taking the spiritualist books, not just reading them here. Taking them. They always reappear, but never with a card. And sometimes with pages marked, as if the reader couldn't decide whether it was comfort or instruction." "Which titles?" Purbright asked. "Two on seances, one on—" She swallowed. "Ghostly visitations, and another, silent conversations. An older text." Purbright considered the titles as though arranging them on an invisible shelf. "Were they taken recently?" Miss Peebling nodded. "Within the last fortnight. And this morning one was returned before I arrived. I found it lying on the entry mat, damp from the mist." He lifted his gaze. "You didn't see who left it?" "No one." "But—" She reached beneath the counter, retrieving a scrap of folded paper. This was inside it. Purbright opened it with care. A short line, written in the same slanting hand as the letter found in the church, stared up at him. The living forget too quickly, the dead remember what we wish they would not. He folded it with quiet precision and slipped it into his pocket. Miss Peebeling watched him anxiously. "Will you tell the others?" she asked. "Not yet," Purbright said. "A little silence can be more revealing than a great deal of talk." He left the library with that silence settling around him, broken only by the distant toll of a shop bell and the soft scuff of his shoes on the damp pavement. The afternoon light was fading, casting long shadows across the gravestones as he neared the churchyard once more. A man whispering to ghosts, a hat, 2 letters, a vanishing figure, and now the quiet borrowing of books meant to converse with the dead. Purbright felt the threads gently tug, not urgently, not yet, but with purpose. By the following morning, Flaxborough had settled on its favourite solution. The visitor at St. Olaf's was almost certainly a harmless, eccentric, a traveller of peculiar habits who had paused in town long enough to commune with the stonework. This explanation rolled through the streets with the comforting weight of something that required no further thought. People repeated it with the same agreeable certainty they used when discussing the weather or the price of scones. At the post office, the theory flourished. Mrs. Mottram, sorting envelopes with a rhythmic flick, announced to anyone within earshot that she had once encountered a rambler who slept in churchyards for the peace of the thing. A man in line behind her embellished this by suggesting that some wanderers believed spirits protected their dreams. This was accepted without challenge, and the conclusion that Flaxborough had hosted such a wanderer seemed, for the moment, inevitable. Near the marketplace, 2 shopkeepers discussed the matter between sweeping their doorsteps. One claimed to have seen a bedroll tucked behind a monument days earlier. The other suggested that the whispering might simply have been a man reciting poetry to himself. Both smiled, pleased at the rationality of their reasoning. A visiting poet was far easier to digest than a ghostly confidant. Purbright, passing with his hands quietly clasped behind his back, listened without interrupting. He acknowledged each greeting with a courteous nod, offering no encouragement to the theory nor discouragement. He had long understood that towns, like individuals, often preferred the most painless explanation, even when it bent noticeably at the corners. Outside St. Olaf's, the vicar stood on the steps, absorbing the gentle spread of this new consensus. It straightened his posture and lightened his expression. "Inspector," he called, descending the final step with renewed optimism. "It appears we may have been over-concerned. Several parishioners recall seeing a man with a pack near the churchyard earlier in the week. A traveller, no doubt, possibly sleeping rough." "It is certainly possible," Purbright replied, pausing by the low stone wall. "Churches often offer quiet shelter to those in need." The vicar nodded vigorously. "Quite. And the whispering? A man speaking to himself is hardly unusual. Loneliness does produce conversational improvisations." "True," Purbright agreed, though the note he left was a rather formal improvisation. The vicar hesitated, optimism wavering. A poetic flourish, perhaps. Some itinerants write to steady themselves. Purbright gave a thoughtful hum, polite enough not to disturb the vicar's comfort, yet non-committal enough to suggest the conversation was incomplete. Biddle, meanwhile, remained singularly unconvinced. The caretaker stood inside the church, polishing brass once more, though his movements lacked their usual conviction. When Purbright stepped in from the cool air, Biddle lowered his cloth with a decisive shake of the head. "Tourist, my foot," he muttered. "No tourist. Walks about whispering to thin air at 5:30 in the morning, A nun leaves a note with handwriting like a confession. Purbright approached him gently. Flaxborough prefers its mysteries diluted. Aye, Biddle replied, but this one isn't ready to be watered down. The inspector walked the aisle again, his footsteps echoing softly beneath the vaulted ceiling. The pew where the hat had rested seemed unchanged, yet held the faint air of a place recently disturbed, like a chair still warm from an absent occupant. He studied the door to the side yard, noting once more the slight misalignment in the latch. It could be nothing, but nothing often had its own peculiar logic. Outside, a thin veil of mist clung to the gravestones, softening their edges. Purbright stood beside the oldest monument, watching the drifting white tendrils settle among the names etched across centuries. A sparrow hopped along the path before taking flight with a sharp flutter. The town's neat explanation hovered in the air, well-intentioned and convenient. Yet Purbright sensed it was only plaster over a deeper crack. People accepted it because it required no further rearrangement of their routines. It allowed St. Olaf's to remain a quiet church, its stones undisturbed by guilt or sorrow. But the letters, cryptic and confessional, refused to fold themselves neatly into the town's preferred narrative. He lingered as the bells marked the hour, their steady toll rolling across the rooftops. Somewhere beyond the churchyard, shop shutters opened, bicycles rattled along cobbles, and conversation resumed its comfortable rhythm. Life reasserted itself with small, familiar sounds. Purbright slipped his hands into his coat pockets and walked toward the station, the mist trailing behind him like a soft breath. The town might be satisfied, but he was not. Neat explanations rarely held their shape for long. The mist held low over Flaxborough as Purbright reached the station, a pale vapour drifting through doorways and dissolving against window panes. He paused in the entrance hall, brushing a trace of moisture from his sleeve before climbing the stairs to his office. The room greeted him with its familiar quiet. The low hum of the radiator, the faint tap of a loose window latch, and the lingering smell of old files that had absorbed decades of cautious inquiry. It was within this calm that the small clues began to align themselves. He set the brown evidence envelope on his desk, sliding out the hat first. Turning it over in the steady light, he detected a faint aroma, old pipe smoke, clinging stubbornly to the fabric as though unwilling to let go of its owner. Purbright lifted it closer, letting the scent drift upward. It was not fresh, but neither was it ancient, a fragrance resurrected from a habit abandoned rather than forgotten. Someone who smoked seldom, discreetly, or perhaps had given it up only recently. He rested the hat beside the letter and considered the fragment of dried mud he had noticed earlier on the pew at St. Olaf's. Biddle had claimed the churchyard soil was usually too compact to leave such a trace indoors, particularly at dawn. This mud, a darker clay, suggested someone coming from the lower end of the cemetery, where earth tended to soften beneath overhanging yews. Purbright pictured the route, a quiet corner visited rarely, noticeable only to those who preferred solitude to ceremony. A faint rustle sounded as he unfolded the second slip of paper from the library, the one Miss Peebling had entrusted to him. The same slanted script, the same elliptical tone, as though the writer addressed shadows rather than people. The dead remember what we wish they would not. Purbright read it twice, letting the words settle like dust on a polished surface. The sentiment spoke of remorse, not mischief, a confession addressed to an audience incapable of judgment. Love entered quietly, reporting that inquiries into the initials EM had returned nothing recent. No one missing. No visitors registered, no complaints lodged. It was an absence notable in itself, a man present only in traces, scent, ink, and disturbed soil. Purbright thanked him and returned to the hat, tapping a finger lightly along the lining. A faint indentation in the band suggested the owner had pushed it habitually back on his head, an old-fashioned gesture more common among older men than younger ones. He recalled, then, an old list filed months earlier, residents who had quietly withdrawn from public life. Love found it after a brief search, the thin folder creaking open like a murmured admission. Among the names was one, Edwin March, a former accountant, retired abruptly, vanished from church committees. His last known address, a modest terrace near the edge of town, had been reported vacant, though rent continued to be paid by post. A solitary man, unobtrusive, with a reputation for precision and a fondness for evening walks along the quieter paths. Purbright traced the line of March's entry with a thoughtful thumb. An accountant's retreat from society was not unusual, yet the combination of pipe smoke, solitary habits, and an evident fixation on spirits, albeit of the non-inebriating kind, fit together with a peculiar neatness. He wondered whether March's withdrawal had been prompted by grief, guilt, or the simple fatigue of a man who had spent too long balancing other people's ledgers and not enough time reconciling his own. The inspector stepped outside again, the air sharper now, carrying the faint toll of the church bell across the rooftops. The sound drifted in hollow waves, folding around corners and slipping between chimneys. He followed the path leading toward March's old street, the cobbles slick beneath his shoes. Curtains twitched as he passed, though no one called out. Flaxborough valued its privacy almost as much as its gossip. March's former house stood near the end of the Bay lane, its windows clean but expressionless. A faint scent of pipe smoke hovered near the gate, delicate enough to suggest memory rather than presence. Purbright lingered, studying the doorstep for any sign of recent use, a faint scuff, a smear of damp earth, a leaf crushed underfoot. He crouched briefly, fingertips brushing the stone. The soil caught beneath the edge bore the same darker color as the mud on the pew. As he rose, a small movement at the window opposite caught his eye. A neighbor, startled to be noticed, retreated behind a curtain with a haste that revealed more nervousness than curiosity. Purbright filed the detail away. Nervous neighbors often knew more than confident ones. He remained for another quiet moment, letting the mist curl around him like a thoughtful pause. The thread had been found, not a rope to pull hard upon, but a delicate filament requiring patience. It stretched from church pew to library desk, from pipe smoke to vanished accountant. Not yet enough to speak aloud, yet more than enough to follow. Purbright turned back toward the town, the faint echo of his footsteps absorbed by the damp air, carrying with him the quiet certainty that the whispering man was no stranger at all. Morning light crept reluctantly across Flaxborough, filtering through thin mist that clung to gutters and garden hedges. Purbright, returning from March's deserted terrace, found the town beginning to stir with its usual blend of purpose and distraction. A milk cart rattled along High Street, a dog barked at nothing in particular, bicycles coasted past with their tires whispering over damp cobbles, yet beneath these ordinary sounds lay something more unsettled, a faint tremor of unease awakening in unexpected corners. At Mrs. Larch's doorstep, this unease was on full display. She greeted Purbright with a troubled expression, her hands worrying the hem of her cardigan. The inspector had stopped only to ask whether she had seen anything unusual the night before, but his simple question seemed to free a tide of anxieties. "It's my husband's watch, Inspector," she said in a low voice, glancing down the street as though the watch itself might overhear. "It went missing last week. I kept it in his old jacket pocket. He always said it brought him luck." She paused, swallowing the ache in her throat. "I looked again this morning. The pocket's empty." Purbright considered the detail gently. "Is there any sign someone entered the house?" "No, nothing moved, nothing touched, just gone." Her voice softened. "Some people grieve noisily, Inspector. I do it by keeping things where they belong." He offered a reassuring nod, sensing that the missing watch was part of a larger pattern, one involving solitude, unsaid apologies, and memories disturbed rather than stolen. He took his leave with polite assurance, slipping her concern into the quiet ledger forming in his mind. Farther down the lane, a different sort of confession waited. Young Terence Froude, lanky and perpetually dishevelled, hovered by the notice board outside the station with the air of someone preparing to surrender a guilty secret. When Purbright approached, the boy stepped forward, twisting his cap between nervous fingers. "Inspector, sir, I should probably tell you something." His voice cracked, then steadied. "People been talking about the ghost in the churchyard. I might have added to it." "In what way?" Purbright asked, softly enough to prevent undue panic. "I wrote a story, just a silly thing, put it through a few letterboxes last night, about a man who comes back after dark to visit his own grave." He flushed. "I didn't think anyone would take it serious." Purbright kept his tone mild. "Flaxborough has a generous imagination, Terence. It thrives on such things." "I wasn't trying to upset folks," the boy insisted. "Just wanted people to notice my writing. Thought mysteries were popular." "They are," Purbright said, "but the timing is unfortunate." Terence deflated. "So it's not a ghost, then?" "Ghosts," Purbright replied, "would rarely leave hats." The boy managed a thin smile, and Purbright sent him home with instructions to resist the urge to publish further nocturnal experiments. The confession, though largely harmless, contributed another ripple to the widening circle of unease. From the station, Purbright walked toward the edge of town where allotments and sheds formed a loosely arranged patchwork of private labours. The air smelled of damp soil and lingering smoke from small fires lit to clear autumn leaves. Here he found Mrs. Harbank standing rigidly by her garden fence, staring toward the narrow gap behind her shed. "I heard someone crying last night," she said, before he even introduced himself. "Not loudly, just quietly, as if they didn't want anybody to notice." "Could it have been a neighbour?" Purbright asked. She shook her head. "The sound came from behind the shed. I went out with a torch, but there was nothing there, just the cold and that odd feeling you get when someone's been where they shouldn't." Purbright stepped carefully along the path, the damp earth yielding beneath his shoes. Behind the shed lay a patch of flattened grass, still marked with the faint impression of a crouched figure. Nearby, a smear of darker soil suggested someone had brushed their hand or sleeve against the ground before rising. "Did you notice anything else?" he asked. "A smell," she replied. "Like old smoke. My father used to smoke a pipe, and it reminded me of that." Purbright let the detail settle, its significance growing clearer. March's presence felt closer here, less like a memory, more like a shadow passing quietly through familiar spaces. As he walked back toward the road, the town continued unfolding around him, murmured conversations at garden gates, blinds twitching, footsteps pausing when he passed. Each whisper, each observation seemed to pull another thread from the fabric of a man who had retreated from the world, yet could not quite disappear from it. The breeze carried the distant toll of the church bell, muffled by fog. Purbright paused, listening, as the sound faded into the soft rustle of leaves. The clues were subtle, almost shy, but they were leading him toward guilt, solitude, and a man who whispered to the dead because he feared speaking to the living. The town was unfolding, yes, and somewhere within it, so was Edwin March. Dusk settled with a slow, bruised glow, the sky bruising into shades of violet and copper as the town drifted toward its evening quiet. Purbright walked the familiar path toward St. Olaf's, drawn less by urgency than by a steady instinct, as though the day were gently guiding him back to its source. The air had thickened, cool and metallic, carrying the far-off toll of a bell being tested for the night service. Leaves rustled along the churchyard wall with soft, restless whispers. He stepped through the lich gate just as the light shifted, one of those subtle dusk transitions that altered depth and shadow in an instant. Gravel crunched beneath his shoes, a blackbird darted low across the stones, and then from the far side of the churchyard a shape moved, not imagined, not mistaken. A figure, thin, hunched slightly, slipped between the gravestones with deliberate haste. Purbright stopped. The man paused at the edge of a monument, half lit by the fading glow, half hidden by shadow. For a moment, the air held still, dense as held breath. Then the figure turned sharply and fled. Purbright followed without sprinting, knowing that panic rarely aided precision. He heard the rapid patter of steps ahead, the scrape of shoe against stone, the laboured breath of someone unaccustomed to running. The inspector's own pace remained measured, his silhouette threading neatly between headstones as he closed the distance. The figure reached the far wall, where an old maintenance shed stood, long disused and leaning. But instead of circling it, the man dropped to his knees beside a low metal hatch, half covered in ivy. A hatch Purbright had forgotten even existed. The man wrenched it open with surprising strength. A hollow clang echoed across the yard, followed by a gust of cold, earthy air rising from below. Without hesitation, the figure swung his legs into the opening and vanished into darkness. Purbright reached the hatch a moment later. He knelt, one hand bracing against the damp stone, peering into the void. A narrow ladder descended into an old catacomb passage, once meant for storage, later abandoned when funds for maintenance dissolved. The air rising from it smelled of soil, rust, and something older. He listened. For a moment, nothing. Then faint echoes, footsteps retreating along a stony corridor, the rhythm uneven but purposeful. Purbright stood, brushing soil from his hand. This was no wanderer seeking shelter, nor a nervous townsman congratulating himself on a bit of atmospheric mischief. This was someone who knew the churchyard intimately, someone who moved with a mixture of desperation and familiarity. He closed the hatch gently but did not latch it, letting it rest against its frame. The crisp evening air pressed around him, cool against his face. A gust swept across the stones, lifting a scattering of leaves into a brief spiral. The church windows glowed faintly now, their stained glass flickering with candlelight from within. As he walked back along the path, Purbright noted the changes dusk had brought. Shadows elongated, bending across graves in slender arcs. The scent of old smoke drifted faintly, unmistakable and familiar, as though drawn upward from the dark tunnels beneath. A solitary lamp flickered near the porch, casting a wavering halo over the door. Approaching the nave, he found Biddle emerging with a bucket and mop, muttering irritably to himself. The caretaker startled when he saw the inspector's expression. "Is something wrong, sir?" Biddle asked, gripping the mop handle like a staff. "Possibly," Purbright said, brushing a trace of cold from his coat. "Someone was here just now. They ran." The caretaker frowned. "Ran in daylight?" "In dusk," Purbright corrected gently. "It seems the light suited their purpose." Biddle stepped closer, lowering his voice. "Was it him?" Purbright gave a mild, thoughtful hum. "Someone who wished not to be seen." and who knows this churchyard rather better than a visitor would." Biddle's face paled. "Then he's been here before?" "Likely many times," Purbright replied. He glanced toward the darkening yard where mist began to gather again in soft, silvery curls. The hatch lay hidden once more beneath ivy and failing light. Beneath it, old passages curled like forgotten roots under the church, silent except for the fading echo of hurried footsteps. Purbright withdrew the note from his pocket, the one from the library, and read it again under the lantern's glow. "The dead remember what we wish they would not." In the dim light, the words seemed to pulse with a deeper resonance, as though stitched into the soil. He returned the paper to his coat and stood in the hush of the evening, listening to the distant cries of settling birds and the low hum of approaching night. The presence in the churchyard was no longer an abstraction, no longer a rumour passed through windows and across shop counters. It was real. It was frightened. And it carried a burden heavy enough to send a man underground rather than face the open air. Purbright exhaled slowly, letting the cold settle around him. The matter had slipped beyond eccentricity. Now it whispered of danger. Night deepened across Flaxborough in a slow, deliberate hush, as though the town were lowering its voice out of courtesy for whatever moved beneath the churchyard. Purbright walked from St. Olaf's with measured steps, the cool air threading around him like a reminder to think carefully rather than quickly. Lamps flickered along the street, their reflections wavering in shallow puddles. Each faint echo of his footsteps seemed to rise and settle again with contemplative restraint. At the station, he laid the two notes side by side on his desk. Their handwriting aligned perfectly, each slanted serif leaning forward like a man stepping toward the past rather than the present. Purbright traced the first lines with a fingertip, not out of habit, but as though reacquainting himself with someone speaking timidly through ink. "If you judge me, do so softly. The dead remember what we wish they would not." These were not the thoughts of a man deceiving others. They were attempts, awkward, fragile attempts, to explain himself without having the strength to face an audience. Confessions issued into empty pews and long-forgotten tunnels. Words offered to ghosts rather than to the living. Purbright leaned back, letting the silence broaden. The radiator clicked softly. Paper rustled in the draught from the half-open window. Through the glass, faint lights shimmered from the distant church spire, haloed by the evening mist. He began assembling the pattern with the caution of someone handling delicate glass. Loneliness came first. Edwin March, by all accounts, had retreated from his colleagues long before he retired. A quiet man, his life had narrowed into small, manageable routines. If he visited the churchyard after dusk, it was not to frighten, but to find a space where no one expected anything from him. Then guilt, its shape visible not through crime, but through the peculiar phrasing of the notes. Guilt often pushed men toward confessions, but March seemed to fear confessing to the living, preferring the company of those who could not reject or correct him. That pointed to an emotional wound rather than a legal one. Purbright lifted the hat again. The faint pipe scent had warmed slightly under the desk lamp, rising in thin, ghost-like curls. It reminded him of the patch of earth behind Mrs. Harbank's shed where someone had crouched in the night. A man whispering, not to ghosts perhaps, but to someone he imagined he had wronged. What unsettled Purbright was the displacement. Men burdened by guilt typically sought clergy, old friends, or even the police. March sought gravestones, dead listeners, silent absolution. It was the behavior of someone who believed forgiveness was not truly available to him. Purbright opened the small file on March again, flipping past dates, addresses, committee memberships. A modest life, lacking drama, shaped by numbers and caution. Yet even lives of modest structure could conceal sudden fractures. Something had pushed March into the shadows. A soft knock interrupted his thoughts. Sergeant Love stepped in, carrying a thin stack of papers. "These are the old maintenance maps you asked for, sir? The catacomb tunnels." He set them down, brushing dust from his fingers. "Looks like they haven't been inspected for, well, quite a time." Purbright studied the drawn lines, narrow passages, small chambers, drainage routes. One branch ran directly beneath the oldest section of the churchyard, emerging near the hatch where March had vanished. "Thank you, love," he said. The sergeant paused. "Do you think he's hiding down there?" Purbright considered before answering. "Hiding suggests fear of others. This feels more like someone avoiding himself." Love frowned, puzzled but respectful. "Shall I get a search team?" "Not yet," Purbright said, folding the maps. "For now, let the quiet speak a little longer." Love left with a nod, and the room settled again into thoughtful stillness. Outside, a foghorn sounded faintly from the river, its low moan echoing across rooftops. Purbright stood and walked to the window, watching the mist weave between chimneys like something searching. He recalled Biddle's certainty that the whispering man was no tourist, and Mrs. Larch's missing watch, a personal object, tied to memory rather than value. The watch might have been taken not for theft, but for remembrance. A strange act, but grief often rearranged a man's logic. Purbright returned to the desk and picked up the first letter once more. The last word, softly, seemed to carry an additional weight now. A plea not for exoneration, but for gentleness. Whatever March felt he had done, it was grave only in his own conscience. Yet the flight into the tunnels troubled Purbright. It suggested a change, a tipping from sorrow into fear. He extinguished the desk lamp, gathered the notes and maps, and stepped into the corridor. His shoes echoed down the staircase as the station clock chimed the hour. Above the rooftops, the church tower loomed half-shrouded in fog. Something waited beneath it, a man, a confession, a wound, reopened by silence. Purbright continued toward it with quiet resolve, knowing the next step would require both caution and compassion. A pale rim of dawn crept over Flaxborough, its first light thinning the night fog into slow-drifting wisps that curled around gravestones like drowsy sentinels. Purbright crossed the churchyard, with a flask of tea in one hand and his coat collar turned modestly against the cold. The air tasted of wet stone and frost-bitten leaves. Even the birds had not yet decided whether morning truly warranted their attention. He reached the porch of St. Olaf's and let himself inside. The nave was still and dim, the stained glass windows holding only a faint promise of colour. Purbright moved softly between the pews until he reached the front, where he placed the flask on the ledge beside a hymnal. Then he sat, folded his hands and waited. If March came, he would come here. This was the place where his silence found voice. His breath rose faintly in the cool air, dissolving into the hush. Now and then the old wood creaked, a slow settling of the building's bones. Far above, a pigeon shifted, its wings making a muted flutter. Purbright kept his gaze forward, avoiding the temptation to look over his shoulder. He wanted to hear the man before seeing him. It did not take long. A soft scrape sounded near the side door, the careful sound of someone easing it open just enough to slip through. Then footsteps, hesitant, deliberate, barefoot, or in thin soles. Purbright remained still. A figure approached the pews, stopping 2 rows behind him. The inspector heard a tremor of breath, sharp and unsteady. Then the whispering began, not spectral, not theatrical, simply a man speaking to people who were not there. The words came in murmured fragments, addressed to shadows Purbright could not see. "I didn't mean to. I should have spoken sooner. I'm sorry you never heard it from me." Purbright waited for the pauses, small silences that revealed more than the whispers themselves. Then gently, he turned his head just enough for his voice to carry. "They cannot answer you," he said, "but I can." A rustle of alarm. The figure stepped back, a hurried scrape of heel against stone. No, I shouldn't be here," the man stammered. "Please, I only came to speak before they wake." Purbright rose slowly, hands open in a gesture meant for frightened animals and fragile truths. "Mr. March." The man froze. Edwin March stood thin and pale, hair unkempt, his coat hanging loosely over a frame, diminished by weeks of solitude. His eyes shone in the dimness, not with anger, but with the strain of a man who had carried a weight too long. "You shouldn't know my name," he whispered. "You left it in the pew," Purbright replied. "Or at least its initials, and your words left themselves everywhere you walked." March sank onto the end of a pew, as though the strength in his legs had suddenly fled. He pressed a hand to his forehead. "I didn't want anyone involved. I'm not dangerous." "No," Purbright said softly. "Only burdened." March shook his head hard. "You don't understand. I have spoken to them for months, quietly, so quietly. They hear me here. This is where they last were. This is where I can face them." "Whom do you think you were speaking to, Mr. March?" March's breath hitched. "My brother, my wife, anyone I failed, anyone I disappointed. I should have apologized while they were alive." Purbright moved to sit across from him, the pew groaning under their combined stillness. "You do not speak to ghosts," he said. "You speak to memories, to versions of them who cannot contradict the story you've told yourself." March's eyes filled with a fragile brightness. It felt easier to talk to them this way, no judgment, no pain for them, only the chance to say what I never said. Purbright poured a cup of tea from his flask and placed it gently between them. Steam rose in a thin, wavering ribbon. "Guilt grows loud in quiet places," Purbright said, "especially when one lives alone with it. But you have harmed no one. And hiding in tunnels is no penance, only fear." March wrapped his hands around the cup, as if its warmth might anchor him. "I took the watch," he whispered. "Mrs. Larch's husband. I saw it in the charity box outside her door. I remembered him wearing it. I thought, if I held it for a moment, maybe he would forgive me for not visiting him when he was ill." "You returned it," Purbright said, "left it by her shed." March nodded, eyes lowered. "I was afraid to give it back properly." "You meant well," Purbright murmured. "Not wisely, perhaps, but kindly." The church held its breath around them. Light strengthened through the stained glass, colouring the floor in faint washes of blue and amber. March looked up, the tension in his shoulders easing by fragile degrees. "I thought the dead were the only ones who would listen," he said. Purbright managed a quiet smile. "The living do on occasion, particularly when spoken to softly." March closed his eyes, exhaling a long-held breath. The whispering had stopped now. Only the soft clink of the teacup and the warming light remained. Purbright rose, offering a steady hand. "Come outside," he said. "Morning has begun, and guilt prefers the dark." March hesitated, then took his hand. Together they walked down the aisle, the church slowly brightening, as though relieved to be carrying one less shadow. They stepped out into the churchyard as the first clear tones of morning bells drifted over the rooftops, scattering the last folds of mist. March blinked at the brightness, as if unused to the world revealed rather than imagined. Purbright kept a gentle pace beside him, neither guiding nor restraining, merely accompanying like a patient shadow. At the far corner of the yard, Biddle was already at work, gathering fallen branches with the solemnity of a man tidying after an untidy night. He straightened sharply when he saw them. "Inspector! Good heavens, is that—" "It is," Purbright said, with a calmness that suggested everything was far less alarming than it had seemed. "Mr. March has decided to visit above ground for a change." March managed a faint, apologetic nod. Biddle eyed him with a mixture of relief and lingering suspicion, then muttered something about putting the kettle on, and retreated toward the vestry. They took the path toward the vicarage, passing the old maintenance hatch now shining faintly in the early light. March lowered his gaze as they crossed it, a quiet acknowledgment of the shadows he had abandoned. Purbright allowed the silence to settle naturally between them until they reached the gate. Mrs. Larch appeared just then, carrying a small parcel wrapped in brown paper. She stopped when she recognized the inspector. "Oh, Inspector Purbright, I was just on my way to the station. Someone left this on my doorstep." She held it out, hands trembling slightly. Purbright opened the parcel with care. Inside lay the watch, its brass surface wiped clean, chain neatly coiled, ticking once more with the small, stubborn pride of something repaired. Mrs. Larch pressed a hand to her mouth. "I don't understand. Where did it come from?" Purbright glanced briefly at March, whose pale face tightened with quiet remorse. But the inspector spared him the embarrassment of a direct admission. "It seems," Purbright said gently, "that someone recognized its value to you and wished to make amends. The manner of its return may not have been elegant, but the intention was sound." Mrs. Larch nodded, tears softening her expression. "He wore it every day," she whispered. "I thought I'd lost the last piece of him." "Now it has been found," Purbright replied. "And perhaps that is enough." March stepped back slightly as though worried his presence might disturb her calm. Mrs. Larch gave him a thin, uncertain smile. Politeness mingled with gratitude she did not think to question. The town's explanations, once tangled with talk of ghosts, were already shifting to more comfortable ground. By the time Purbright walked March toward the station, news had moved through the early streets. The watch had been misplaced, then discovered. The mysterious figure in the churchyard was merely a gentleman troubled by memories. No haunting remained except in overactive imaginations. These tidier accounts multiplied with reassuring speed. Shopkeepers nodded knowingly. Gardeners murmured, "Ah, that explains it." Even the milkman, who had earlier sworn he'd seen something float near the church gate, now firmly remembered it as a plastic bag. Purbright escorted March to a quiet office, offering him a chair and a moment of stillness. The man sat with his hands folded, as though afraid to break anything more delicate than silence. "I don't expect to be forgiven," March said, voice soft. "Forgiveness," Purbright replied, "is rarely a single event, more an ongoing conversation, one best held with the living." March looked down, then nodded once. Arrangements were made, a doctor to visit, a neighbor alerted, provisions quietly organized. Nothing dramatic, nothing punitive, merely the restoration of a man to a life he had quietly stepped away from. When March finally rose to leave, he paused at the doorway. "Inspector, thank you." Purbright inclined his head. "Politeness restored, Mr. March. That is all." After the man departed, Purbright lingered by the window, watching the town return to its usual rhythms, brooms sweeping, voices rising, shutters opening. The imagined hauntings had dispersed as gently as morning fog, leaving behind only the faintest trace of sympathy. He allowed himself a private, wry smile. Few men sought forgiveness from phantoms. Fewer still deserved answers from them. But March had spoken into the silence, and in doing so had revealed something undeniably human. Purbright folded his hands behind his back and stepped into the corridor, the day widening before him with quiet clarity. By mid-afternoon, Flaxborough had settled back into its familiar composure, the morning's brief flutter of intrigue folded neatly into the town's quiet routines. The vicar moved through St. Olaf's with renewed ease, lighting candles for evensong, their flames trembling gently in the draughts that slipped beneath the ancient doors. Each wick caught with a soft sigh, casting small halos of gold onto the stone. Biddle resumed his dusting with the fastidious energy of a man reclaiming order. His feather brush whisked over hymnals, lecterns, and railings, accompanied by faint mutters that suggested relief rather than complaint. Now and then he glanced toward the pew where the hat had once rested, as if ensuring it did not return. Outside, the churchyard shed its strangeness. Children traced paths through fallen leaves. A pair of crows argued amiably from the yew branches. The grass glowed with that subdued brilliance of late autumn. The maintenance hatch remained closed but no longer ominous, blending once more into the mottled tapestry of ivy and stone. In the marketplace, the tale of the ghost whisperer had already softened into an anecdote. Mrs. Mottram at the post office now retold it with a fond chuckle, adjusting the details with each telling. The greengrocer embellished his own version, insisting he'd predicted all along that the figure was merely a man working through his thoughts. Even young Terence Froude, chastened but relieved, nodded earnestly when customers praised his imaginative bent, careful to avoid any further publications. Mrs. Larch, watch restored and grief soothed by its return, walked home with a lighter step. She paused at the church gate long enough to give Biddle a polite wave, as though silently acknowledging that not all hauntings were of the supernatural sort. For most, the incident faded into that category of gentle oddities Flaxborough occasionally produced, a story to fill the space between weather complaints and gardening advice. Only Purbright carried its weight a little longer. As evening approached, he left the station and walked beneath the arching branches that lined the road toward home. The sky had taken on a soft apricot tint, the sun melting into the horizon with the unhurried resignation of autumn. Leaves drifted down around him, turning in slow spirals before settling onto the pavement with quiet taps. His footsteps echoed with a calm rhythm. He welcomed the stillness, letting the town's familiar scents, wood smoke, damp earth, distant baking, wrap gently around him. It was in such unremarkable hours that Flaxborough revealed its truest character, mild-mannered, observant, rarely intrusive, but always listening. Purbright reflected on March's whispered confessions. There had been no crime, no villainy, only the small tragedies of human regret. Guilt could drive a man underground more effectively than any pursuit, and loneliness could turn silence into a companion of terrible intimacy. That March chose gravestones as his audience was a peculiarity, yes, but not an incomprehensible one. People sought absolution where they believed it might be granted, whether by priest, memory, or imagined ghost. He paused beneath an enormous beech tree, its leaves clinging in rustling clusters overhead. A soft breeze brushed past, sending a faint whisper through the branches. It carried no message, yet the sound prompted a thoughtful smile. Flaxborough seemed in that moment both deeply ordinary and quietly extraordinary, its calm surface concealing the tender complexities of those who lived beneath it. Purbright felt the peculiar affection that often came upon him toward the town, a blend of amusement, patience, and a sympathy he seldom admitted aloud. The first lamps flickered to life along the roadside, their warm glow turning the mist into a soft veil of gold. Purbright resumed his walk, coat pockets warmed by the last rays of sun. Somewhere behind him, the church bells began their evening chime, steady and reassuring as if marking the close of both day and story. He reached his gate just as a final leaf drifted down beside him. He brushed it aside lightly and stepped through, the quiet of home welcoming him with its measured silence. Flaxborough continued. The town exhaled, and Purbright, with the faintest nod to the fading light, stepped inside.